Well, today I'm joined by Professor Michael Huemer. Together, Professor Huemer and I go through his book, Knowledge, Reality and Value, a Mostly Common Sense Guide to Philosophy. It's a book that I've read quite a few times. I read it about 6 months ago, and then I listened to it, the Audible version, just to make it sink in. And then I reread it in the last kind of just over a week to really get this into my brain, to get the right questions, to have Professor Huemer come on to give us this sort of introduction to philosophy, or this introduction to philosophical reasoning. We're going to dive into an array of areas, looking at things like ethics, knowledge, theism, atheism, free will, and a couple of others as well. And it's just a really good introduction, and hopefully a way for you to appreciate kind of how philosophy is done, and also hopefully go away and pick up this book. I highly recommend it as an introduction to philosophy. It's a great way to expose yourself to argumentation, to begin to understand some of the language or the jargon that's used, and to hopefully kind of really appreciate the journey and the conversations that you find here on the channel as well. If it's your first time checking out the show, I'd ask you to hit subscribe, and then if you're on YouTube, select the bell notification icon. That will remind you whenever we release a conversation here on the channel. If you wouldn't mind giving this video a thumbs up and then sharing it with your friends, family, followers, whoever you think will find this a helpful conversation on philosophical reasoning, please do share it. We grow because you share our content. So yeah, make sure you find the right people and give this episode a share with them. Right, enough of that for now. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Professor Michael Huemer. Cheers. Hello and welcome to the show. My name's Samuel, and today I'm joined by the one and only Professor Michael Huemer. Professor Huemer, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So I've read Knowledge, Reality and Value, a Mostly Common Sense Guide to Philosophy. Fancy that. Yeah, strange. And I read it a few times, actually. I've read it, I've listened to it, and then I reread it over the last kind of 7 days to really make sure I've drilled as much of it into my head as possible for this conversation.
Yeah.
And we have like a whole bunch of questions, which will kind of be giving the viewer and the listener a bit of an overview to the book. So hopefully it will whet their appetite to go away and pick it up, because I highly recommend it. But before we dive into the good stuff, as I like to call it, would you mind giving everybody a bit of an overview about yourself and the sort of work that you do?
So I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado in Boulder, where I've been, I don't know, for like 25 years or something like that. I've written about 10 books and about 80 academic articles. So, I have a popular blog called Fake News on Substack, which everybody should check out and subscribe to. I've got a YouTube channel with some videos that you can check out. I don't upload new ones very often, so but there's a bunch that are already there. So, and I don't know, my most famous book is probably The Problem of Political Authority. Rather, it's most famous among non-academic people, right? Because it's of interest, especially to libertarians. So,
interesting. I was going to ask you, actually. Obviously, kind of this was published in 2021, I believe. Have you sort of noticed a sort of increase in kind of demand for your time and stuff since these sort of they're obviously still academic books, but they're written more so that people can access them due to the price range and stuff. So have you noticed more of a sort of an uptick in kind of people getting hold of you or emailing you since you started releasing books like this one?
I'm not sure. For the first part of my career, I didn't really write about very popular topics. I was mostly doing epistemology, which is my initial area of specialization on what they hired me for. And then, but I did notice a big uptick in attention when I wrote about political philosophy, the problem of political authority, on especially from libertarians. Okay, and then I noticed another uptick in attention during the pandemic, which I assume was because of the pandemic, that people started inviting me on podcasts. So I assume people were doing more podcasting then. And then it's continued since then. So, I don't know, I've appeared on dozens of podcasts since then.
Yeah, you have. I enjoy kind of following a few, like Parker's Pensy. I know you've been on with him quite a few
Yeah,
times.
I was on that 5 times, I think. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're fantastic conversations. So, I mean, all this stuff will be linked in the description, by the way. So, listener, viewer, like, there'll be many resources to go and check out after this conversation.
yeah. Oh,
Okay.
and by the way, like, the textbooks, like, they've sold better than all of my other books. Like, so, like, so I think that, like, 1 year of sales of the textbook outdid all of my academic books combined, right?
Wow. Okay. Okay. Yeah, because I think Emerson Green as well is a big fan. I mean, basically, most people that I respect in philosophy plug this book. So, yeah, there you go. That says something, right? For sure. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive into the questions. So I've kind of got different parts, as you will, for these. The sort of first one's going to be kind of all around knowledge and kind of critical thinking potentially as well. So I kind of want to give the audience a bit of a flavour for your book, as I've already mentioned, but also if this is one of the first conversations somebody might be hearing about sort of philosophical inquiry and wanting to understand some of these different terms and concepts, hopefully we can kind of lead them through it step by step. At least that's how I've structured the questions anyway. So we'll see how we go with that. So the first question is really around sort of concept formation and knowledge acquisition. So the question says, how do individuals genuinely acquire concepts? And in the realm of philosophy, how is knowledge typically attained through logical arguments and common experiences?
Yeah, good. So, like, those two questions are related, but basically, the important thing to notice about how people acquire concepts is it's mostly from experience, and it's from experience with many examples of the thing that the concept would apply to. And so, like, if you want to get somebody to acquire the concept of knowledge, the way that you do this is not by telling them what knowledge is. Okay. And by the way, if you've studied epistemology, one reason why you don't do that is that nobody knows what it is, right? Or like, it's not exactly that we don't know what it is, but nobody knows a description that's adequate, right? So nobody can give a definition that is immune from other philosophers' objections and counterexamples. That's one reason why you don't tell them. And also because that in general is not how people acquire concepts. So how does a kid acquire the concept of knowledge? Because like we all have it, even though we can't define it, right? Okay. And well, the answer is they see examples of knowledge, right? So they hear somebody saying, does John know that such and such? And then they hear somebody else saying, no, he doesn't know it because blah, 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 right? Or he does know it. And then they observe people doing something that other people call coming to know. And then after they see enough examples of that, they try to imitate the usage of that word by the adults, right? And children are amazingly good at this. Actually, they don't need that many examples, right? So you see a few examples and they go, oh, I get it, right? It's this kind of situation. And they start using the word know that way. And when they're able to use the word correctly in the right circumstances, that's when they have the concept of knowledge, right? And that's how most concepts are, because that's how they're acquired. That means that you don't need to give definitions. Right. In order to understand the concept, you don't need to know the definition. And as a matter of fact, for most concepts, nobody does know the definition.
Yeah. Good call. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. So, that was like the first part of your question. The other part was something about how we acquire knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it sort of, it seems, I don't know, sometimes potentially counterintuitive, like the way that we begin to try and pick things up. So for instance, I've been reading this book, right? I'm trying to learn and grow and understand in my sort of philosophical reasoning and understand different concepts and how they're used. And, like the sort of kind of term deontology, it's still quite new to me. So I'm still trying to understand how that all applies. And then I'm kind of pointing to things like, obligations or rights or imperatives potentially, and kind of saying, well, these things fit into that, but that doesn't necessarily define the whole of what deontology means. And it's almost like I've got to use the word in written form and in conversational form to begin to actually allow the concept to flourish and sort of take root. I don't know, does that kind of speak to what you just said, I imagine, hopefully?
No, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. So like, you could read philosophical literature and then you could find articles where somebody tries to define deontological ethics, right? And that would give you some idea. It would not be useless, right? So if you've never heard the term before, then it would give you some sense, but it wouldn't exactly give you sense. Because the way that you would get to understand it, the way philosophers understand, is by reading a bunch of these ethicists that are now called deontological ethicists, but they did not call themselves that way. So like Immanuel Kant is the famous deontologist, but he didn't call himself a deontologist, right? So, okay, but you could read what his ethical view is, and then people call that deontological, right? Okay, so then when you see enough examples, and then you see the debates between those people and then the other people that are called consequentialists, and you sort of like see where they disagree, then you get a better sense of what deontological ethics is. So, and that's how a lot of philosophical terms are, right? So like, you take a philosophy class and somebody tells you there's some word that ends in ism, and then they tell you what that refers to. But then, and you're like, okay, that's what it means. But like later in your philosophical career, you discover somebody who was considered a such and such ist, but they don't satisfy the definition. Okay, and so then what you realize is, well, the way like existentialism, like where did that word come from? It didn't come from somebody just deciding, I'm going to define this view as existentialism. What happened was there were a bunch of philosophers who were saying a bunch of stuff, and then observers said, these people seem kind of similar to each other. Like it's Sartre and Camus and Kierkegaard, they seem kind of similar to each other. Let's call those people something. Let's call them existentialists. Okay. So the real concept is the thing that's, stuff that's like what those people are saying. That's what it really refers to, right? Of course, that's not very helpful if you're like talking to a beginning student, right? Because they haven't read all those people, right? But anyway, after you read all these existentialists, then that's when you actually know what it means.
Yeah, it takes work, right? You need to actually kind of go away and actually begin to grapple and grasp with what these individuals are saying to then be able to onboard the sort of bigger sort of concept or the framing of that section of philosophy almost. It is fascinating.
Yeah. Like this is like related to Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblances, where he was, he gave the example of trying to define the word game, right? Which is really hard because there are a lot of things that don't seem very similar that are called games, right? And so he said, well, there wasn't really a definition. It's just that there are characteristics that are positively correlated with each other. And if a thing has enough of these characteristics, then you call it a game. And that's like a lot of concepts, right?
Interesting. Yeah, the way things develop and change. Okay, so I kind of want to talk about, I guess, argument understanding and how we would evaluate an argument. So the sort of question goes, what characterizes an argument and how are deductive and non-deductive arguments differentiated and critically evaluated within a philosophical framework? I do have an example from your book. I think I might share my screen at this point. We can at least get that up so people can see that if they're watching. If you're listening, you obviously won't be able to see this because you've chosen the audio form. So I'll kind of just read this out, so then we can kind of talk about it against the question. So number one, the number of stars in the universe is even. If the number of stars in the universe is even, then the theory of evolution is true. Therefore, the theory of evolution is true. Or number two, the number of stars in the universe is odd. If the number of the stars in the universe is odd, then the theory of evolution is true. Therefore, the theory of evolution is true. And obviously, kind of one of those two is correct, but we have absolutely no idea which one it is, which is the kind of whole point of this example. So the sort of question then, just to go back over that. So what characterizes an argument and how are deductive and non-deductive arguments differentiated and critically evaluated within a philosophical framework?
Yeah. So an argument is an attempt to provide reasons for believing something, right? So the thing that you're trying to support is known as the conclusion, and the information you're starting with that's supposed to support it is known as the premises. And then sometimes there are intermediary steps that are supposed to help you see how the premises support the conclusion. Deductive arguments are ones in which the premises are supposed to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. And the reason I said supposed to is, well, there are fallacious arguments, okay? But the person who's giving the argument is representing that these premises guarantee that the conclusion will be true. And a non-deductive argument is one where the premises support the conclusion, but without guaranteeing it. So they just make the conclusion more likely to be true or something like that. Okay, so now, traditionally in a philosophy class, you'd be told, here are some good characteristics of an argument. If you give an argument, you want it to be valid. And what that means is just that the premises entail the conclusion. So it would be impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. And then this is if it's a deductive argument, right? Which a lot of arguments, most arguments in philosophy are deductive. So, okay, so you want it to be valid. Also, you want the premises to be true. And so if it's valid and the premises are true, then we call it a, quote, sound argument. And then the third thing is you want it to be non-circular. Okay, so, and now the reason I gave this example with the number of stars in the universe is that one of those arguments is sound and it's non-circular. Okay, because, neither of the premises by itself entails the conclusion. So, right, so a fortiori, neither of the premises is identical to the conclusion, so it's not a circular argument. And, the premises entail the conclusion, and then one of them has true premises. Okay, but neither of these is a good argument, right? Okay, so it illustrates that having a sound argument isn't enough. Rather, what you want is an argument where the premises seem obvious, right? So the problem with both of those is that neither of them has premises that seem obvious. Right, and that, so like, you wouldn't know which one of those is correct, right? Without some further reasoning that isn't provided.
Yeah, you'd have to do a lot of work or count all the stars to actually come to understand which one of these is actually correct.
Oh yeah, and by the way, like even if you know how many stars there are exactly, you still wouldn't know which is correct because of the if-then premise, right? Well, if you know the theory of evolution is true, then you know the if-then premise. Right, but you wouldn't know if the if-then premise was true without knowing the theory of evolution. So.
Interesting. Okay, that's really helpful. I'll stop sharing this. There are a couple more examples that I'll bring up on the screen as we go through. Again, they're all from the book. So the next one is really kind of around rational beliefs and objectivity. So, something that I kind of always try and grapple with. So how are rational beliefs defined, and what steps are recommended to enhance objectivity in thinking and decision making?
Yeah, so I mean, rational beliefs are just beliefs that are sort of truth oriented. So there are different kinds of things that can explain people's beliefs. So sometimes you believe something because you want it to be true, or you might believe something because you think that good people are supposed to believe that, right? Or because members of your social group believe that. Okay, now people wouldn't explicitly say that to themselves, like, I'm going to believe this because my group believes it. But it could nevertheless be true that that's the actual reason why they believe it, okay? So then those would be beliefs that are not truth-oriented. So being rational, forming beliefs rationally refers to forming them in a way that's truth-oriented. In other words, you're trying to get correct beliefs, and you're being influenced by the actual evidence for the beliefs, right? And so, if you're thinking rationally, you want to avoid committing logical fallacies, you want to avoid contradicting yourself, and you want your beliefs to be based on evidence, right? Most of the time, right? Unless they're just self-evident beliefs or something like that. So, okay. And part of rationality is objectivity, which is avoiding bias, right? So, biases are these things like you have emotional reactions to something and that influences what you want to believe, right? Or, sometimes your self-interest influences what you want to believe. You want to believe the thing that would be in your interest to believe or something like that. Okay, so, how do you attain objectivity? One thing is you want to try to identify your own biases, and just being aware of them makes it easier to avoid being biased. So how do you identify your biases? Well, it's sort of like if you're having strong emotional reactions to an issue, then there's a good chance that you're biased, right? That pretty much makes you biased, right? Okay, and by the way, that's true even if the emotional reaction is appropriate. Okay, so like you're thinking about the abortion issue and you're getting really upset because all these babies are being murdered. Okay, and that could be true. It could be that they're being murdered, but whether or not that's true, it's also true that you're biased because of your emotional reaction, right? It's going to prevent you from thinking objectively. So, okay, second thing that you want to do is you want to diversify your information sources. So like a lot of people, when they're thinking about issues, and it's especially about controversial issues, they get information from sources that they already know agree with them. You know in advance that this person is going to say something that I'm going to like. Okay. And then if you do that, well, okay, that's not really truth oriented, right? Okay. So what you need to do is get information from the other side. And also, by the way, like often there's more than two sides. So you should get information from people with different perspectives, but smart people with different perspectives, right? Okay, so if you're watching MSNBC and you say, okay, well, I'm going to get a balanced perspective, so I'm going to watch Newsmax. That's not what I mean, right? I mean, look for a smart and honest conservative or something, right? Okay. And the third thing you should do is just try to think of objections. If you have a belief that a lot of people disagree with, just try to think to yourself, what would a smart person who disagrees with me say about what I'm now thinking? Like whatever. I think abortion is wrong. What would a smart pro-abortion people say? And I've got an argument because fetuses are persons and killing persons is wrong. Whatever. Okay, so what would the smart person say to that argument? What part would they object to? And most people, I think, just don't even spend any time thinking about that. Right? So if you just spend some time thinking about that, there's a good chance that you will, in fact, notice the flaws in your own reasoning.
Yeah, quite often we sort of marshal our strongest arguments against straw man arguments from the opposition or the people that don't necessarily agree with us or on the same side of the fence as us on specific issues, almost because we kind of A, want to reinforce our own opinion, but B, also is obviously far easier to attack a straw man than it is to steel man the opposition's argument and actually try and, as you just said, understand their best arguments in response to the sort of propositions that you hold. One of the things you said at the very, very beginning is I want to dive into that just a little bit more, which is around sort of having a strong emotional reaction to something. Obviously, it's impossible to decouple emotions. So would you suggest doing things like, kind of steel man in the opposition, reading smart sources from the other side? Those are things that you're going to be doing to begin to make yourself more aware of that emotional reaction, but also to kind of get the best framing. I mean, we're never going to become Spock, right? We're not going to be able to detach emotion fully. So are you saying those things are ways to kind of wind down that emotional response and therefore kind of approach it more kind of systematically? Or are there any other sort of tools you'd suggest to kind of actually, kind of dial that emotion down?
Yeah. My initial thought wasn't, oh, you should get rid of your emotion because it might be an appropriate emotion. My initial thought was, well, you should be a little more skeptical about your own opinions because they could be influenced by that emotion and probably are. Frequently, like, you're defending some controversial position, then like the person on the other side says their view and you just feel angry. Like you feel angry because how could they say that? How can you support baby murder or whatever it is, right? Or, if you're on the left, you're like, how can they, take away people's right to control their own body? It's obviously your own body, whatever. So anyway, so I was thinking like you should be skeptical of yourself, but then I also think like, well, if you reflect on your own reactions, that I think that does have a tendency to tamp them down. So at the moment that you're feeling annoyed at the other person, if you just step back and observe, you observe the fact that I'm feeling angry, then that does make it easier to calm down, right? And then, and just sort of like remind yourself, oh, this is a controversial issue. A large number of people, like half the people, think the thing this other person is saying. So it's probably not true that half the country are, satanic, evil people, right? So, even though it seems wrong to me, it's probably not evil, right? And then maybe you'll start being less angry.
That's interesting. This is a bit of a sideball, so apologies, but kind of obviously having read your book a few times now and kind of engaged with your blog and stuff, very often you're using sort of humor or quips or little things that kind of, I don't know, just kind of bring fresh air into the sort of writing style and sort of persona behind the text. Do you think things like that can lead to people potentially almost agreeing with or wanting to agree with what you're saying because they enjoy reading you?
I'm not sure. I mean, probably, probably works. Like it must work on some people, right? It probably doesn't work on others. Yeah, I try to think like, what's the best way to get through dogmatism or something? Okay, because like dogmatism is a big problem. Like almost everyone is dogmatic, and and by that I just mean like they adjust their beliefs less than they should when they receive counter evidence, right? Like maybe they adjust it a little bit. You have to give really, really strong evidence to make them adjust their belief a little bit. Okay, so anyway, and you think like, yeah, what's the best way of responding to that? And also, if you feel like people are giving ridiculous arguments, then so you could say that's ridiculous. Like, is that going to work? No, but so or just start like saying, oh well, only an evil person would say that, and just start talking about how bad the other side are. Is that going to work? I mean, my guess is it doesn't work very well. So, so the best thing that I could think of is to make it funny. Like how the Babylon Bee and the Onion make jokes about contemporary events. Then that might be the best approach, right? Because even if you're on the other side and then they make the joke, like maybe you actually find yourself laughing, right? And so, then that might be an easier way to make you realize that, oh, actually, they have a point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, there's sort of two elements to this. One is obviously humor is a fantastic tool to kind of engage with extremely painful and tricky subjects that you might have a strong emotional reaction to, like death or something like that. Obviously, one that a lot of people struggle with, but actually humor around death can help people to come to terms with things that might have happened or be happening to them or family, etc. And obviously also kind of if you've got a philosophy book that is, X pages long, if it's dry and stuffy, people aren't going to read it. You need it to be engaging and enlightening, and kind of you want to read the next thing, right? You want it to continue on. So yeah, both of those are important, I think, for that.
Yeah. I made a specific effort, like, because usually when philosophers, like when they give examples, they just think of whatever is the most obvious, mundane example. So, I do that, and then I go, oh wait, let me see if I can make this example slightly funnier, right? So whatever, put in marmots or insert funny animals into the example or whatever.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I want to talk about sort of fallacies, so fallacious kind of reasoning and critical thinking. So what constitutes a fallacy in philosophical terms, and why is it important to recognize fallacious reasoning to foster critical thinking skills?
Yeah, I mean, fallacy is basically a thought pattern that appears cogent but isn't, right? Or often to many people appears cogent, like appears to support some conclusion but doesn't really. More generally, people use it just for systematically misleading ways of thinking. Okay, so traditionally, a fallacy is supposed to be an argument, but sometimes people use it more broadly, just to refer to other defects in the way people form beliefs. Okay, so and why is it important to know about them? Because there's a lot of them, and so you probably have a bunch of false beliefs because you've probably fallen prey to a bunch of fallacies. So like if you care about the truth, identifying the fallacies makes you less susceptible to them, right? Okay, and like usually if somebody identifies a fallacy, you can immediately see that it was a fallacy. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't have committed it, though. So, okay, until somebody points it out. All right, so like obvious things are the argument ad hominem, right? Which is, by the way, is not just a name for insulting people. Rather, it refers to incorrectly drawing conclusions from personal characteristics of a person. Like you think that the thing a person is saying is false because they're a bad person. Right. And then, so like the way the fallacy would go in conversation is, I would say, well, according to so-and-so, this happened. And then you say, yeah, but so-and-so is bad. And then you start saying bad things about them. Right. But that doesn't mean that what they said was false. Right. Okay. So like, I think, some contemporary examples, not to get too political, but you remember when Donald Trump was accused of trying to get Ukraine to interfere in our elections, to dig up dirt on Joe Biden. Okay. And his primary response to that was to attack the whistleblower. Right? Notice how that works. So So he also claimed that the call was perfect and whatever. Okay, but a big part of his response was, whoever's accusing me, who's anonymous, by the way, is a bad person. They're another never Trumper, or it's politically motivated, whatever. Okay, now for balance, I have to mention that, of course, this also works on the other side. Okay, so like in the recent story of the Harvard president, Claudine Gay, who was, she had to resign because of plagiarism as well as her inadequate testimony before Congress, right? I think the primary defense of her was, oh, the attacks on her are politically motivated. Okay, it's a bunch of right-wing ideologues, a bunch of MAGA ideologues who are attacking Claudine Gay, and they're bad people. Okay, but anyway, the thing is, in both of these cases, that's irrelevant. So what? Because they're not on trial. Or, if you're trying to decide whether Claudine Gay should step down, you're not trying to decide whether MAGA Republicans should be punished for something. Maybe they should. That's not the question. So it's completely irrelevant, right? And whether they were politically motivated is not what matters. What matters is it true? Did she actually plagiarize this stuff? Okay. And similarly with the Trump case, it doesn't matter if the whistleblower could be a communist. He could be a serial killer for all I care. No, I mean, I want him in prison if he's a serial killer, but that doesn't mean that Trump should get off, right? So anyway, okay. Anyway, so that was sort of like about the ad hominem. These are some other things. People give anecdotal arguments a lot. Like you're trying to support a generalization, then you come up with a couple of examples, and it's usually examples that happened in the news recently. And why is that not a good way of reasoning? Because the anecdotes are usually not a random sample. And they're not a large sample either. Okay, so you give a couple of examples, so it could easily be just by chance you pick the couple of cases in which this thing is true. But then the other thing is, they're usually cherry picked. The person who's giving the example is not just randomly picking. Okay, so okay, and then so the better way of forming beliefs is trying to find the statistics. Right. So like, okay, you're saying, I wonder if we should have more gun control laws in the country. And then you start talking about particular cases of shootings. Well, that's not very relevant, right? Because actually every year there's like thousands, 12,000, 16,000 or something like that of homicides. So like what happened in the most recent thing that occurred on the news where like 3 people were shot is not like, that shouldn't be the basis for a policy. You should look at what's happening in most of the thousands and thousands of cases. Right? So anyway, okay. Another thing, related to this is when people are trying to estimate how common something is, they think about like, they use how easy it is to think of examples as a heuristic for estimating how common it is. Okay. So you're like, I wonder how common it is for white police officers to kill black suspects. And then, so you just start thinking, what cases can I think of in the news? And you're like, oh yeah, there's like George Floyd, there's Eric Garner, there's Breonna Taylor, there's Jacob Blake. Okay. So I just thought of 4 examples. Those were all in the news. Okay, I wonder how common it is for them to shoot white people. I can't think of any examples. So it must be that it's more common to shoot black people. Okay. So anyway, now I don't know if people would think that explicitly, but they would just they would come away with the impression that one of these things is much more common than the other because they can think of examples. But that's not a good way of forming beliefs, because the reason why you can think of examples is not necessarily that it's more common. Right. And in this case, as a matter of fact, it's not, right? It's more common for them to shoot white people. It's just less common for the media to report it, right? But anyway, okay. And then, there's a couple of things that are not exactly fallacies, but there are ways that people go wrong. So a lot of people are dogmatic, right? And also a lot of people are sort of like hair trigger belief formers, right? That is, they assume things. If something seems kind of plausible to you, you just assume that it's true. And so like we form beliefs on the basis of not enough information, right? Okay, so like, and there are studies in psychology of this sort of thing. So like, this is an example. Which is more common, homicide or suicide? Okay, and most people think homicide is more common. but what's the basis for that? Okay, there's not really, it's not really basic. I mean, it's basically that, well, I've heard about homicides on the news more often than suicides, right? Also, you might think to yourself, like most people would think to themselves, you know, I would never want to kill myself, but sometimes I feel like killing other people. Sometimes I feel really mad at other people, but I don't feel mad at myself. So it must be more common. Okay. Of course, you know, from the fact that I'm giving this example that it's not true, right? Suicide is much more common than homicide. Right. So anyway, don't assume, right? When you assume factual matters like that, it's very common that you're wrong, right? A lot more common than you would think.
I want to invite you to join our community on Locals. There is a range of free and supporter-only benefits to check out. On Locals, you can ask guest questions, access the reading plan to prepare for upcoming conversations, get early access to all the full-length video and audio versions of each episode, and meet like-minded followers of the show. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. Wow, there's so much to dive in there. I'm aware as well that there's so many more questions to get through, so we'll pause it there. But yeah, I think we'll definitely have to get you back on the show to talk more about this. Okay, I want to kind of move to Scepticism and Foundationalism then. So I'm going to share my screen again because I want to present an argument from your book, which again is just an example. It's not meant to be anything crazy. So you guys should be able to see that appearing now. So the argument goes, again, I'll read it out for those listening. Premise 1, you can have knowledge of the external world only if you can know that you're not a brain in a vat. Premise 2, you can't know that you're not a brain in a vat. Conclusion, therefore, you cannot have knowledge of the external world. So I think for this, it would be interesting to kind of obviously explore it in regards to the sort of skepticism angle, and we'll kind of get onto phenomenal conservatism and foundationalism shortly. So the question really goes, how does the uncertainty of our existence as potential brains in a vat impact our understanding of reality, truth, and the nature of knowledge?
Yeah, but okay, so does everybody know what a brain in a vat is, or should we say?
Potentially not. Yeah, if you could, that'd be great.
So yeah, so you know, this is a hypothetical scenario. So this is not, in fact, possible currently, but maybe someday it will be possible, right? So imagine that scientists take a human brain out of the body, and then they keep it alive in a vat of nutrients, and then they have wires sticking into the brain. And basically, they stimulate the brain in exactly the pattern that a normal brain is stimulated when it's observing the real world, right? And then, you know, they have a supercomputer to do the calculations to make sure that it produces a accurate simulation of reality, right? It's a perfect simulation, okay? And they adjust what the brain sees when the brain tries to move its body so that the brain will see its body moving when it's trying to move, right? Okay. And then, you know, you can imagine they could program in a simulation of the brain, you know, simulation of listening to a podcast where somebody's talking about a brain in a vat. Okay. So then the question is, oh, how do you know that you're not a brain in a vat right now? Right. Okay. So, and, you know, these skeptics claim that just the scenario and the impossibility of refuting that you're a brain in a vat shows that you don't know anything about the external world, right? Now, okay, you know what? How does this impact our understanding of knowledge? So I think the brain in a vat scenario really does show that we're not absolutely certain of our beliefs about the external world. So, like, I can't 100% refute that I'm a brain in a vat. There's a non-zero probability, I guess, that I'm a brain in a vat. Okay. But I also think that doesn't matter. And so I think that what matters is whether our beliefs are rational or justified. And so, you know, like, clearly you shouldn't believe that you're a brain in a vat, and you should believe that you're a normal person interacting with the normal world, unless and until you gather some actual evidence that you're a brain in a vat. If I get reason to think I'm a brain in a vat, then I'll reconsider, okay? But right now I have no reason at all to think that that's the case. And so, okay, you know, like, and, you know, why should I think about knowledge this way? So I think about, like, I'm what they call a fallibilist, right? I think knowledge is fallible, meaning it's okay to say that I know P, even though I'm fallible. And so like there's some chance that I might be wrong about it. Okay, so, and then there's a bunch of skeptics who say, oh no, you're not allowed to use the word knowledge that way. So if you admit that you're fallible, you have to say that you don't know. Okay, and so why do I not like that? Well, I think that would basically make the concept of knowledge pointless. Right? Or, it would defeat most of the reason why we have a concept of knowledge. I think that we have concepts for navigating the real world, and there would, like the concept of knowledge refers to the thing that most people are calling knowledge. Right? And the way that you form the concept of knowledge, as discussed at the beginning of this, is by encountering examples, and then examples of people having some relation to some fact. And then you hear people say, he knew such and such. That's how you acquire the concept. So the correct understanding of the concept cannot be one that winds up such that none or almost none of the examples on the basis of which you form that concept are actually instances of it, right? That has to be a misunderstanding of the concept. So, okay. Did I answer all of the question?
I think so. I mean, I was going to kind of just push into it a little bit more, if that's okay. So, I mean, obviously you kind of mention in the book that, I say obviously, people won't know. So you kind of mentioned in the book that obviously nobody kind of thinks like this until they come across a sort of skeptical argument. And then skepticism obviously has a very long tradition. You've got academic skepticism, you've got things called Pyrrhonianism, things like this, which are kind of fed into the sort of skeptical way of viewing the world. You look at people like David Hume, classic skeptic, to bigger and smaller degrees, and you see other kind of philosophers kind of coming into this branch. There seems to be a massive, I don't know, kind of, it feels like there's a big tilting towards skepticism and everybody being as skeptical as they can be. And then you kind of wind that down. You see kind of more sort of popular thinkers, somebody like Sam Harris would be skeptical of things like free will, etc. You kind of see this very much in the everyday. Sam Harris, Robert Sapolsky, these sorts of people kind of talking about how we don't have free will, etc. So I guess I just wanted to talk to you very briefly on this idea of kind of skepticism generally. So not necessarily just about this argument, but when somebody sees this argument, they then get presented with a skeptical argument and they then almost accept these premises or find it very difficult to let go of these premises and feel like they're on the back foot all the time. I don't know if you can kind of speak to that a little bit for us.
Yeah. I mean, there are some things that you should be skeptical about, like I guess I'm skeptical about traditional religion, right? So, and I think people should be more skeptical about it, right? But then there's, when philosophers are skeptical, they're like really extra skeptical, okay? So, I have a joke that I like to tell sometimes. It's kind of about this, So, okay. So there's like, there's a philosopher and a mathematician and a physicist and an engineer, and they're sitting in a bar in some foreign country, and they look out the window and they see this black sheep sitting in the field all by itself, right? Okay. And so the engineer looks and he says, oh, what do you know? It looks like the sheep around here are black. Okay. And then the physicist says, well, at least some of them are. Okay, right, properly skeptical. Okay, and then the mathematician goes, well, at least one of them is. Okay, good. And then the philosopher looks at the other three skeptically and says, well, at least on one side. Right, so, okay, so like that's the illustration of how philosophers think. We've just taken it a bit too far, right? The skepticism is going too far here, okay? Yeah, and like you find people, and this has even gotten outside of philosophy. You find people who are skeptical about free will, okay, and then there are people who are skeptical about induction. Well, you could even find scientists who are skeptical about inductive reasoning, okay, and sometimes I think they just don't realize what an insanely radical skepticism that is. Okay, so just about the free will thing. I think that if you don't believe in free will, so that means that you're saying nobody could ever do anything other than what they actually do. I think that means that it's never true that anybody ever should have done anything different from what they did, right? So, like, it's not true that Jeffrey Dahmer shouldn't have murdered and eaten people. You'd have to say that that's false, right? Okay, I think it might even be false that anyone should do anything whatsoever. So even for the things that people did do that were good, it might be, it might be the view implies that it's false that they should have done that. And then, nobody ever deserves praise for anything. Nobody ever deserves blame for anything. Then I think also it implies that it never makes sense to deliberate, right? Whenever you're deliberating, you're making a mistake, because deliberating is trying to decide which of two things you should do. But, there's never any answer to what you should do, because you just have to do one thing, and the other thing that you're deliberating about isn't possible. So it doesn't, if you're deliberating about whether to do something that's impossible, then you're always making a mistake, right? And by the way, that could be true even if you don't know that it's impossible. If it is, in fact, if you're deliberating about whether to do A, and in fact A is impossible, then you're making a mistake. Okay, so if you believe determinism, then you should believe that all deliberation is erroneous. You're always making a mistake when you deliberate about anything whatsoever. Okay, and then I also think that reasoning and talking about whether we have free will is a form of deliberation. It's deliberation about what to believe. So I think the view implies that all reasoning is mistaken. Whenever you're reasoning, you're making a mistake. So nobody should ever reason about anything. Okay, and that means that you shouldn't reason about whether you have free will. Okay, and then the person who's giving the arguments against free will, like, they have to say that they themselves are making a mistake. They shouldn't be telling you that you shouldn't believe in free will. And it's okay. So I just think and just like, if you actually acted as if you believed this, your whole life would collapse. You'd just be like an insane person. People would think you were insane. Okay, luckily that doesn't happen, because luckily for them, none of the determinists actually act as if they believed that, right? And, if you punch a determinist, they will act as if you shouldn't have done it. And, they will have reactive attitudes. They'll get mad or something like that. Okay, so luckily for them, they don't act like they believe it. But if they did, we think they were crazy. And, what does that show? So that doesn't prove that they're wrong, right? But if the people who are defending a belief don't even actually believe it, should the rest of us take it seriously?
Yeah, so interesting. Okay, let's talk about sort of foundationalism then. So a sort of term that you coined, phenomenal conservatism. You define it as a version of foundationalism, stating that, quote, phenomenal conservatism holds that appearances, mental states wherein something seems to you to be the case, are the source of foundational justification, end quote. So can you explore how this differs from other foundationalist perspectives, and also how it answers skepticism?
Yeah, so, the answer to skepticism is pretty straightforward, right? So, my view is the rational way of thinking is starting by assuming that everything is the way it seems. We just start there, okay? And I'm not saying that necessarily everything is the way it seems. I'm saying that's the starting point, okay? We don't start by assuming everything is like some radical deception, okay? And then if you acquire reasons for doubting that things are the way they seem, then you start to revise your beliefs. But you don't revise them for no reason, okay? And furthermore, I claim that this is implicit in how everybody actually forms their beliefs anyway. So, the skeptics are basically inconsistent people. They're people who sometimes form their beliefs in the rational way, but then other times don't. Or they accept some appearances, but then for no particular reason, they don't accept others, right? So, okay, so the skeptic gives this argument, and why are you supposed to accept the argument? You're supposed to accept the argument because the premises seem plausible or something. And if you didn't have that, then, they would just be it would just be like making random assertions, right? Why would I care that this person is making a bunch of assertions that don't seem correct? And why would that even count as a legitimate argument that needed a response? So, okay. But anyway, so what's the response to the skeptics? Okay, so it seems like I'm living in the real world. I don't seem to be a brain in a vat. If you want to suggest that I might be a brain in a vat, you need to give me reasons why that would be likely. Right, but of course there aren't any. Of course, there are no reasons why it's likely that you're a brain in a vat, right? And I'm not saying that they have to prove that I'm a brain in a vat, right? I'm not even saying that, they don't even have to claim that I am, but they've got to give a reason why it would be plausible or it would be likely that I would be a brain in a vat. And there is no reason, right? Okay. Now, it's in principle possible, but you could have an experience where, like, suddenly the world goes blank, and then you see this text that appears that says, "Ah, you're a brain in a vat." Sorry, we've had a problem with the simulation. We're going to have to reboot it. And then everything goes black for a while, and then the world reboots. Okay, so you could have evidence that you're a brain in a vat, but just there isn't any. That has not happened to anyone, right? So okay. What are the alternatives to phenomenal conservatism? Okay. So, in the history of philosophy, most people who thought about the subject were foundationalists. They thought that you have some knowledge that you're allowed to start with that you don't have to give reasons for, and then everything else has to be based on that. So we call those the foundations, and everything else has to be built up from the foundations by cogent inferences. So alternative versions of foundationalism. There's the acquaintance theory, defended famously by Bertrand Russell, which held that there's some things that you're just directly aware of, right? Acquainted with. And so your foundational beliefs are kind of like the simple, obvious beliefs about the things that you're acquainted with. Now, how is that different from the phenomenal conservative view? So my view is the foundational knowledge comes from appearances. So how are appearances different from acquaintance? Like, one thing is acquaintance entails the existence of the object. So you can't be acquainted with X unless X is actually there. And appearance doesn't. So you can have an appearance of a pink rat and there doesn't have to be a pink rat there. Okay. But you can't be acquainted with a pink rat if there isn't a pink rat there. Okay. What I think is better about the appearance theory is, for one thing, it better corresponds to how we form beliefs. So I claim we don't form beliefs based upon acquaintance. We form beliefs based upon appearance. In most cases, those go together. Most of the time, when you have an appearance, it's satisfied by a real thing that's really connected. That explains why you had the appearance, and then so you're also directly aware of the thing. But in the possible case where you're not acquainted, like you're hallucinating, you still form the belief, and that shows that the real explanation for your belief is the appearances. Right. And so my claim is that means that if we want to explain why our beliefs are actually justified, you have to say that appearances are a source of justification and not merely acquaintance. Let's see, what are other versions of foundationalism? They're like the externalists. Okay, so there are people who say that a belief is foundationally justified provided that the method of forming the belief is actually reliable. And note that the view is not that it's justified as long as you're justified in thinking that the belief forming method is reliable. The theory is you're justified as long as the belief forming method is in fact reliable, whether or not you know that it's reliable. Okay. All right. So, so sensory perception is in fact reliable. So we have foundational knowledge from the senses, right? And what I don't like about this is, I don't like externalism. I think that the thing that explains why you're justified has to be something that's internal to you. Right. So if there are two people who are intrinsically identical, forming beliefs in ways that from the inside are exactly the same, then they have to either both be justified or both be unjustified. And why? I don't know. I think partly the point of justification is to give people advice about how they should form beliefs. And it's not helpful to give people advice about how to form beliefs where that advice turns on some things that are external to them, right, that they wouldn't have access to. And so, okay. Maybe that's enough.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. It gives a good sketch kind of between the two different definitions or the two different views, skepticism and foundationalism, where they both get quite nuanced quite quickly. But I think that's helpful for the listener and viewer and myself just to kind of a recap as well. So, I appreciate it. I want to push on then to talk about kind of theism and atheism. Obviously, you've got a chapter on each of those within the book itself. Before we dive into both, I think it'd be good to talk about the way that you define God in the book. So you talk about the sort of the O3 world creator, a God that's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. So all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving. And I was just kind of wanting to kind of start off by kind of asking why this is a good place to start with when we want to talk about God. Is it that we're using a definition that kind of attaches to the sort of obviously three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. They obviously span a vast portion of the globe. A lot of the West fits into one of those three categories. Is that why we're using that definition of God to begin to have this conversation? Like, what are your thoughts behind that?
Well, yeah, it's basically because that's how philosophers in my philosophical tradition, that is the Western tradition, have usually defined it, right? Or something like that, right? And there are some, not exactly the same things, but related things, right? So, like, according to Descartes, God is a supremely perfect being. Okay, the thing that has all perfections, whatever a perfection is, right? Or according to Saint Anselm, God is the thing so great that you can't conceive of anything greater, right? As he put it, that than which a greater cannot be conceived, which is a little bit difficult to parse. So, things so great that you couldn't conceive of anything greater. Okay, and so, but those are closely related to being omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good, right? Because if you're not those three things, then it would be possible to conceive something greater. Okay, so why use this definition? Because that's common in the Western theological tradition. Then you're like, oh, okay, well, why do we care about that? I don't know. Maybe the Western tradition is wrong, and maybe, maybe there's a being that is kind of like God, but doesn't have those three characteristics. And, maybe we should consider that God too. I'm not especially attached to that being, the only okay definition of God, but I do insist that there should be something that's at least something like that, right? Okay, so it's okay with me if somebody says, God is very powerful, but he's not all powerful, that's okay with me. But, if somebody says, yeah, God is a tuna sandwich, that's not okay. Whatever, I'm not the word police, but if somebody says that, then I'm just going to say, well, so you're not talking about God. Like, that's just not what the word means in English. So I don't know why we should talk about that. Or if somebody says, well, I'm just going to define God to be the universe. Okay, well, I agree that the universe exists. So in your sense, God exists, but I don't think that's what anybody else means by God. Right? Or I just don't think that's what it means in English. So I just think you're trying to be deceptive. Like if you define the word to mean something totally different from what it normally means, then I think you're being deceptive, right? It's like you're trying to make it sound like you're a theist, but you're not, right? Right? God is nature or something like that. Okay. So anyway, like I think at least the minimal conception is God should be some kind of conscious being that is somehow responsible for the universe. Like maybe he created the universe, or maybe he rules over the universe or something like that. And it's often thought that he's got to be supernatural, like outside nature. So like if there were aliens who evolved a long time ago and then they created this universe because like they have some super advanced technology for creating singularities, right? Which, it's not inconceivable, like whatever. Maybe all you have to do is create a black hole and then you create a new universe. So like maybe there are aliens who created a black hole and that was that started the Big Bang singularity, right? And then I don't think that's God. I don't think they're God. So because, they evolved by natural selection just like us. So, it's got to be supernatural, whatever that means, or something like that.
Do you, again, a bit of a tangent, obviously the sort of universe came into existence as far as we can tell. Would you define whatever that cause was as a supernatural thing? Or whatever it obviously we have no idea what it was, but obviously it's outside of the realms of nature as defined by the Big Bang. So it's almost like a pre-natural state. I don't know. I've always kind of wondered this kind of, weird.
Well, like cosmologists and physicists have theories about what they would call the origin of the universe, although maybe this isn't what you mean, right, by the universe, right? Because they don't mean the origin of absolutely everything. Right. So when astronomers say the universe, they mean sort of like, like all the stuff you can see in our telescopes, including the Earth, right? So a theory is it was a quantum vacuum fluctuation, which roughly means so-called empty space in quantum mechanics has energy. And then you could have a chance event that somehow makes the empty space transition to a lower energy state, which releases a large amount of energy. And like, maybe that was what happened with the Big Bang, right? And the theory would be there's infinite space and it happens very rarely, but every once in a while in this infinite expanse of space, this event spontaneously happens where a universe appears. Okay. And by the way, the reason why it's not getting cluttered up with universes is that space is expanding. So we're constantly like, there's any 2 points in space, there's like more space appearing in between them. So, okay. And so all of the previous universes, the reason we're not seeing them is that space keeps expanding so that they're just too far away for us to see. And we're never going to see them because they're moving away too quickly, right? Okay. Anyway, so that's a theory about the origin of the universe, but it's not supernatural, right? It would be described by laws of nature, right? Or the physicist Lee Smolin has a theory that every time there's a black hole, it creates a new universe. I think that's his view, right? Although, and not an expert, but anyway, so there could be natural causes for this universe. Now you might think, oh, but then that doesn't explain the stuff that was there before in the universe. Like, okay, so the universe gets created from a black hole. Well, where did the black hole come from? So that came from a star that collapsed. Where'd that star come from? It was in another universe. Okay, what would be the answer to this? So, well, maybe it just goes back infinitely. So then there's no original creation, right? So if you want something that actually created all of physical reality, not just, quote, this universe, then I guess it would have to be supernatural.
Interesting. Very interesting. I kind of want to dive into the sort of non-spatio-temporal elements before the universe came into being, but I think, again, one for another conversation. Speaking of universes, though, I think it'd be good to talk about the design argument and sort of fine-tuning. So obviously the design argument is quite well known. The sort of watch that somebody sees on the floor, picks it up, they kind of look at that and they intuit from this that it's been created and designed. And then somebody looks around at life and evolution before we knew what evolution was, and we would say, this looks like it's been designed to fit into their environments, etc. Obviously, the theory of evolution comes onto the scene and causes a lot of challenges to the sort of design argument. But as you rightly point out in the book, and I've read elsewhere from many people, the universe could be said to be fine-tuned, that the various elements and constants, etc., are in a certain parameters that means that life happens to be able to evolve, i.e. kind of we're here on Earth and we're part of the universe. So I guess it'd be interesting to kind of understand how we address the counter-argument that the apparent fine-tuning could be a result of chance or natural processes. And does this challenge the idea of a deliberate cosmic designer at all?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. Anything could be the result of chance, but that's not a good explanation, right? So it's just, so the problem is, well, it's just extraordinarily unlikely. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that people say. And so, I'm not a physicist, so all I can do is say what people have told me, right? But the kind of thing they say is like, if the gravitational constant were a little bit different, and really a very little bit different from its current value, then there wouldn't be any life. So if the gravitational constant were a little bit bigger, then the universe would have recollapsed before stars formed, and there wouldn't be any life. Right? And just to test it, in case you were thinking that maybe there would be some completely different kind of life, like, what's your credence that we're going to find life in a cloud of hydrogen? There's no life there, okay? Like, people who are searching for life, they're not going to search anywhere except on planets, right? Which formed as a result of stellar nebulae, okay? So there had to be stars first. So anyway, and then if the gravitational constant were a little bit weaker, then the universe would have expanded too quickly for stars to form at all. So then there wouldn't be any people. Okay. And, when they say things like this, they say things like, if you adjusted it by 1/10⁴ of its current value, that would result in there not being life. Now, I don't know if that was, the right number, but it's ridiculously small adjustments result in there not being any life. And there's a whole bunch of things. It's not just the gravitational constant. There's things like the mass of the proton or the ratio of the gravitational to the electromagnetic force. Right? And then they just sort of reason through different reasons why life would be impossible if these parameters were different. Okay. So you get things like, there not being any elements heavier than hydrogen if you adjust some of the parameters. Okay. And then, well, nobody thinks that you can make a life form out of hydrogen. So there wouldn't be any life, right? So, okay. So then you're like, oh, why is it that way? And you might think, oh, just chance. Okay. Well, that just seems extraordinarily unlikely. I don't know what the probability is. I can't calculate it explicitly, but it just seems super unlikely. Right. Okay. And then, like one response is, oh no, actually you can't assign probabilities to the laws of nature being a certain way. Some people say this, right? Because, I don't know, because maybe the laws of nature have to be the way that they are. Because maybe that's part of the nature of a law, that it just has to be that way. So anyway, my response to this is, well, imagine a scenario in which we discovered previously unnoticed consequences of the laws of nature. So suppose that we discovered that there's a particular kind of crystal where, like when you get certain chemicals together, they just form into this crystal pattern, and it forms into a shape that under a microscope looks like the English words "made by God" in Times New Roman font. And everybody who looks through the microscope sees it. Okay. And then, the chemists are like, oh, wow, why did this happen? And then they eventually figure out that this is actually a consequence of some really weird specific values of parameters in the laws of nature that we didn't previously notice had this consequence. Okay. Now you imagine somebody throwing up their hands and going, yeah, that doesn't show anything. That's just, just coincidence, just happened to be that way. No, right? Okay. Because you can't assign probabilities to the laws of nature, so there's no probabilistic argument here to be made at all. That's not any evidence at all that there was any intelligent design, okay? And now, by the way, I'm not saying that this would be conclusive proof that there was a God. It wouldn't be conclusive proof, but would it be evidence that there's a God? Yes, or that at least that there was an intelligent being who had influence over the laws of nature. I think it would be evidence of that. Okay, so that means that any objection to the fine-tuning argument that implies that you wouldn't have evidence for intelligent design even in that scenario must be wrong. Okay, so the objection to the fine-tuning argument, which says, well, you can't assign probabilities to the laws of nature, that must be wrong, right? Because that implies that even in the made by God scenario, you would have no evidence for intelligent design. Right?
So if somebody was to start with the O3 world creator, as we previously defined it, and then comes to the fine-tuning argument, they could potentially use that as a as backing to their God. So they have to previously begin with that position to then kind of use that. But if somebody was to come to just the fine-tuning argument, there's obviously a whole ton of work that they'd have to do to then come to the conclusion that the O3 world designer or creator is that God that has intuited the universe and put those parameters in place to kind of have life being able to come into existence in our universe. So it's quite interesting because it's the sort of fine-tuning argument on its own doesn't get you to where you potentially want to go as a theist if you were one.
Yep.
But actually, if you're already theist, it's quite an interesting argument to have like an arrow to have in your quiver, right? To be able to use in a conversation, because it's going to make the skeptic theoretically have to kind of squirm a little bit potentially. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so like the fine-tuning argument is an argument for intelligent design. Theism is a form of intelligent design theory, so in that sense it's supported, but theism goes further than intelligent design. It says that the designer was omnipotent and omniscient and perfectly good. And I don't know what reason we have for believing that. So if you're going to create a universe, like if you could adjust the parameters of the laws of nature, you must be pretty powerful. But you don't have to be all powerful. And as a matter of fact, I think omnipotence might be logically impossible. Okay, but it's not logically impossible for there to be a being who could adjust the laws of nature. So, but I think that might be enough to call them God, right? Like if there's a being who can create the laws of nature and they created the universe, that's kind of okay. That's kind of enough to call them God. Omniscience, I think omniscience also might be impossible, right? But this gets into my views about infinity, right? I think that might be an impossible form of the infinite. Because it involves infinite information density. And then, being perfectly good, maybe being perfectly good is possible. Yes, I don't have a problem with that, but I don't see evidence that the creator doesn't appear to be perfectly good, if there is one, because wouldn't he make a better world than this, right? Or he's not powerful enough to make a better world.
Well, this is it. Yeah, this kind of feeds into the problem of evil or badness, as you place it in your book. I do have both of your versions of the argument. I can pull them up if needed to, but I'll ask the question first, and you let me know whether it's worth showing these on the screen. So the question really is, in the context of the evidential problem of evil rather than the logical, how might our understanding of the moral significance of suffering impact our assessment of whether the existence of widespread intense suffering is compatible with an O3 deity?
Yeah. Yeah, so, traditionally people think the traditional problem was like, it looks like the existence of evil is incompatible with the O3 world creator because, okay, so he's omniscient. So he would have foreseen, when he created the world, would have foreseen that there was going to be evil. And since he's omnipotent, he could have made it differently so that there would never be any evil. Because he's perfectly good, he's opposed to evil. Isn't good opposed to evil? Okay. So then he wouldn't create it that way. He wouldn't make it so that there was any evil. And if somehow evil appeared, then he could immediately remove it because he's omnipotent. And he would be aware of it because he's omniscient. And he would be against evil because he's good, so he would eliminate it. So, like, on the face of it, it looks like it's just impossible for there to be evil if there's a God. Okay, but then people say, oh, well, maybe there's some reasons why it would be better to allow evil. And then, like, on the face of it, it seems like you should always eliminate evil. But then when you think about it a little bit more, maybe there could be good things that can only occur if there's evil, right? So, like, maybe there are some moral virtues that you can only develop if there's something bad. So maybe you can only have the virtue of courage if there's such a thing as danger, right? Or at least there's the appearance of danger, which is itself kind of bad, right? But also, like, there can't really be an appearance of danger if nothing bad ever happens. If nothing bad ever happens, then you know that nothing bad is going to happen. So, okay. All right. So anyway, so like, actually, yeah, it's not absurd that there could be evils. Okay. But, when you look around at the world around you, does it look like all of the bad things that happen really serve some good? It doesn't look that way. Right. So there's at least evidence that there's not a perfect creator, right? Okay. So, like I gave that example of how, you could develop courage in response to danger. And, there are other virtues that you develop in response to adversity. Like maybe after going through hard times, you develop more strength of character and, perseverance and fortitude and stuff like that. Also, maybe when you see other people undergoing hard times, then you develop the virtue of charity and compassion. Okay, good. Cool. Right. And maybe if you're a religious person, maybe it's plausible that the value of having these moral virtues outweighs the disvalue of suffering. Right. And like, this is not ad hoc at all. This is already their view. Right? They already think that moral virtue is more important than pleasure and pain. So, okay. But the thing is, like, it just doesn't look like that's true of all suffering. Okay, so like, what about suffering of children who have like childhood cancer? Like, like it's super hard to say that, anyway, and they die as children. Okay, it's super hard to say that the badness of that is outweighed, right? And you think like who's developing the virtue? Like, okay, the kid is developing a little bit of virtue, maybe. And then the parents, like, they're going to develop virtue. Imagine somebody telling you, you know what? I just infected this kid with a deadly disease. You know why? Because it was going to help him develop character, and his parents too. Like, that would be a horrible person, right? Okay. But anyway, and then, what about all the suffering in the natural world, right? Because like the lives of animals are pretty bad. And then like, a bunch of them die by being eaten alive, which I imagine is an unpleasant experience. Okay. And like, they're not developing any virtue from that because, they're not really capable of virtue and vice. Right. And then the other thing is like, actually sometimes suffering and adversity develops vice. And it's really not obvious that it develops virtue more often than it develops vice, right? So you hear these stories about horrible criminals, and then you hear about their childhood, and so often it turns out that they had a horrible childhood. So like it did not create virtue, right? Now, so like I don't really know how it all adds up, right? But it's far from obvious that the suffering is overall worth it, right?
If you're watching this, then I just wanted to let you know that you can access the same content in audio-only form by subscribing via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible. In fact, you can search for the Socratic Sessions in your favourite podcast app, and whilst you're there, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others to discover these conversations. All links are in the description, and thank you. I've spoken to many theists and apologists in my time, and one of the sort of classic, I guess, final theodicy that kind of gets used more often than not, I wanted to get your take on this, is this idea that kind of infinity is what ensues for sentient life. So it could be Homo sapiens or prior existences of Homo sapiens, so Neanderthalus, whatever. It could be a squirrel in a tree, potentially, as you've already spoken about in other shows, could have a soul, and a soul could therefore equal consistency. So kind of, especially speaking to sort of theists in general, the sort of idea is that they are okay with the idea of evil, given that whatever we experience, even that child who gets cancer, etc., dies in a few weeks, horrific time, is their life is a net negative, because their existence isn't just their life, it's infinite, theoretically. Therefore, the goodness to come is going to far outweigh any negativity that we have at all. Do you think there's any weight to that sort of theodicy?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not totally stupid. Like, I can follow it, but I don't buy it, right? I mean, so... here's a story that I like to tell to illustrate the problem, right? Okay. Imagine that, I'm living up in the mountains of Colorado, and I have exactly one neighbor, and my neighbor happens to be a serial killer. And suppose that I'm aware of this because I can see him taking the bodies into his house, and then I can hear the screams as he's torturing them. And then he takes the dead bodies out. Okay. And then, but I don't do anything about it. And then, eventually the FBI catches up with the serial killer, they arrest him, and then they come over, they see me over there, and they come over to interview me. And they're like, "Hey, Professor Huemer, did you know about your neighbor here?" That what he was doing? And I go, "Yep, I saw everything. I'm all seeing, all knowing," right? Okay. And they go, "Wow, you could have done something about it, right?" I was like, "Yep, I could have easily stopped it anytime I wanted to," right? Were you afraid that he would hurt you or something? Like, nope, he can't touch me. I'm totally safe, and I could easily stop at any time. I was totally aware of it. And they're like, "So are you a sicko? Do you just like seeing people be tortured and killed?" And I'm like, no, I love all people very much, right? I'm completely loving. Then what? Why didn't you do anything, right? And then you imagine that I say, "Yeah, well, I just, I wanted people to develop virtue. And then I just didn't want to interfere with the murderer's free will." How's that? How's that for an explanation? No, right? That's no good. Okay. And then, you suggested the explanation of, well, there's going to be an infinite afterlife. Okay. So the FBI is talking to me. They didn't like my other explanations that I didn't want to interfere with the murderer's free will and all. So I go, well, because the thing is, like, this life is only a finite existence. And those victims who were murdered, they're now in heaven, and that's going to be infinite. So it doesn't matter what happens in this world; it's going to be infinitely outweighed. So, whenever I see somebody being tortured, I just shrug my shoulders. I don't care, because the afterlife is infinite. Like, this is not a thing that a good person would think.
Yeah, I can feel myself squirming and grimacing in my chair. So, yeah, fair play. Okay, let's move on to free will. I'm aware that we've already spoken about it slightly, but I think it'd be good just to really hone in on it, because it's such a common conversational point of topic. I think you recently had a conversation with Robert Sapolsky, actually, or a debate on free will, which I'll link in the. Yeah. I'll link it in the description. I really enjoyed it, and then Joe Schmidt had a really interesting follow up, which I'll also put in the description. Okay, so you kind of talk about the requirement for alternative possibilities. So you kind of say that there are two conditions required for free will. Condition number one, alternate possibilities. You must sometimes have more than one thing you can do. And condition number two, self-control. You must have control of your own actions. Can you explore the way that this feeds into human agency?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah. So those two things are the way people usually think about free will. I guess I'll just say something about why we say those things, right? So, and they're not redundant, right? So here's an example. Let's say that there's this robot which has a computer brain that controls its actions. Okay, and so, whatever, it's an artificial intelligence, so it goes around the world and it successfully navigates. And you would say, oh, so it does have the second condition, it has self-control. So the robot is controlling its own movements. It's not just being pushed around by external forces. But the other thing I want to tell you, though, is that the program that it's running, it's just an algorithm, right? It's a really super complicated algorithm, but it's an algorithm. So every decision that it makes is the result of a mathematical calculation, which has exactly that result, right? It can't have any other result because it's a math problem, right? Right. But which, by the way, is true of current AI, right? The thing that it outputs is it's the translation of a string of numbers that's the result of a really long arithmetic problem into text. Okay. So, and the arithmetic problem couldn't have another answer, right? Although, there could be a randomizer inside it, right? Okay. And it could, its answers could change depending on the time of day or some irrelevant thing like that. Okay. But anyway, so it doesn't have free will, right? Okay. So the reason is it doesn't have alternate possibilities. The thing that it decides is always the thing that it had to decide, right? Okay, now, all right, so here's another example. Let's say, there's there's some radioactive material in your brain, and periodically it randomly decays. And then, when it decays, it emits a particle that causes you to perform an action. Okay, now do you have free will? No. Okay, right. I mean, at least that doesn't give you free will. Okay, but so that's an example where you have alternate possibilities, but you don't have self-control, right? So there's alternate possibilities because, and the reason I said the thing about radioactive atoms is that it's widely agreed that it's completely unpredictable. When a radioactive atom decays is totally random. It just has a certain probability in quantum mechanics of decaying in a given time period, but it can't be predicted. So, okay, so you have alternate possibilities. You can do the action or not do the action. Depending upon whether the atom decays, but you're not in control of that because you can't control when a radioactive atom decays. So, okay, so that's why you need both of those conditions to have free will. All right, and then the problem of free will is, at least there's an argument from the anti-free will people that you can't have both of those conditions, right? So, the popular argument or a popular argument against free will is, okay, first of all, if determinism is true, then you don't have alternate possibilities. So determinism is a view that everything that happens had a sufficient cause. So whenever anything happened, there were a set of conditions beforehand that are causally sufficient for that thing to happen, right? Or another way of putting it is, if you know the initial conditions of some physical system and you know all of the laws of nature, then you could predict the future. You could predict how it will evolve over time, and there's only one way for it to evolve. So then there's no alternate possibilities. Okay, so if determinism is true, no alternate possibilities, so no free will. Okay, but then what if indeterminism is true? In some interpretations of quantum mechanics, I guess the dominant interpretation of quantum mechanics, indeterminism is true. Then you do have alternate possibilities, but then you don't have self-control. Because if our behavior is sometimes unpredictable because of quantum mechanics, that just means that it's random what we do. But we don't have control over some little particle in our brains just randomly doing something, right? I don't know what it would randomly do, but anyway, randomly some electrical impulse goes down a nerve, and then that causes you to perform an action. So then that would give you alternate possibilities depending on whether the random event happened or not, but it wouldn't give you self-control. Okay, so either way, you don't have free will, right? Whether you have determinism or indeterminism. So, okay, so that's the problem of free will. That's the modern version of the problem, I guess. The problem used to be just that people thought determinism was true. And then, these determinists were like, okay, so we don't have free will. But then, with modern quantum mechanics, people were thinking, oh, actually, it kind of looks like determinism isn't true. But then the anti-free will people were like, oh yeah, but we're still not going to accept free will, right? Because that just means that your actions are random, and random things aren't controlled by anyone. Yeah. So, okay. And then, like, oh, so what's the answer? How could we possibly have free will? And, basically you need some kind of mind-body dualist view, right? Where consciousness is something distinct from physical phenomena, and it can have effects. So you have mental states, you have conscious experiences, and you have a mind, which isn't a physical object. So your mind isn't the same as your brain, right? Okay. And your mind can cause things to happen in your brain. Like that could be the explanation of how you have free will. So it's not just like a particle in you randomly moving.
So there's like an experiment that I've heard on a few podcasts around free will, and it's meant to show you that you don't really have an option as to what appears to you. So there's sort of, I mean, I won't make you do it, but I'll kind of explain it from my perspective. So the host or whoever will ask you to think of, I don't know, let's use the example of a pizza, because I think you talk about pizza when you refer to the ontological argument in your book, talk about pizza. So someone says to me, think of a pizza, and I go, I don't know, pineapple and vegan ham. And they go, okay, cool. Can you tell me why you didn't think about pepperoni, or you didn't think about mozzarella or margarita or whatever it is? And you kind of meant to go through a few examples. You could use the example of an album or a film or something else, basically. There are only a few options that are presented to you at the time. You don't really have any choices around those options that are presented to you. And the reason why you landed on one of the options and not the other one seems mysterious. It's almost like you can't quite explain why you didn't say pepperoni and why you went for pineapple and vegan ham instead. So this experiment, or this kind of setup, I guess, is just meant to suggest that there is a fundamental mystery as to why one option prevailed and all the other ones didn't. The example I've used before is asking somebody why they didn't think of Rush Hour 3. First of all, it's a terrible and fantastic film. And secondly, nobody's ever going to think of that. So I guess that's presented very often as underlying the fact that the options presented to us are fundamentally mysteries, and why one takes precedent over any other options that were present to us also feels like it's a fundamental mystery. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Professor Huemer?
Well, I mean, so first, like, I'm not sure why this is a problem for free will. Like, okay, it could be a mystery. Free will is mysterious, right? Like, I agree with that. Okay, but then the other thing was like, well, this example, it appears to be deliberately picked so that you could say it was a mystery, but like you could pick other examples where it wouldn't seem mysterious, right? Okay, so like, I'm thinking about buying a house, and I go and like I find this house that's for sale, and then I offer them $100,000 for it, and they turn it down, and then I go, why did you turn it down? And they go, well, because the asking price was $500,000, like, and the other comparable units, the other comparable houses in this area have sold for like 500, 550, 490, whatever. So that's why we reject it. It's not a mystery, right? Like there are many times when it's not a mystery why you did something. You know why you did it, right? Like you thought of the options, and then you saw that there was a good reason for doing one thing, and then you did it. Sometimes that happens. So, like, it's not always like a hidden, weird, unconscious motive or anything like that.
I love it. That's so interesting. Okay, so I want to talk about compatibilism. You kind of mentioned how most philosophers hold the position of compatibilism in regards to free will, and how most people on the face of it, without doing any research or study, it just seems to be nonsensical. Doesn't make sense, right? And just for those listening, compatibilism is the idea that kind of we have free will, but determinism holds. Determinism is true. So I'd love you to explore this and kind of explain kind of why this seems to be the prevailing view, and how, I mean, I'm aware that you could write a book on this, right? But kind of how it makes sense. Like, why does compatibilism seem to be the place that most philosophers land in within the free will space?
Yeah. So, I want to clarify, like, because my impression is that when you tell students this, the compatibilists accept both free will and determinism, they try to change it to something that makes more sense to them. So, like, they assume that what you mean is the compatibilist thinks that some actions are determined and some are free, so they're combining freedom with determinism. That's not what they think. They think all actions are completely determined, and nevertheless, some of them are still free. Right, the very thing that you were determined to do, you could still have done freely, even though you couldn't do otherwise. Right, in one sense, you couldn't do otherwise, but there's some other sense of could in which you could have done otherwise. Okay. Anyway, like why do most philosophers think this? Okay, so one motivation is, well, just it really seems like we have free will. I don't know, like when I make choices, it often just really feels to me like I'm free, and definitely seems like there is a distinction to be drawn between the normal case where like I made that offer to the to the homeowner and they decided not to take it. There's a difference between that and the case where somebody holds you up at gunpoint and says, "Give me your money," and then you give them money. Like you're less free in the second case. It definitely seems like there's a distinction there. But also, a bunch of people thought there was good reason to believe determinism. Okay, so then you feel attracted to both views, so then you try to figure out how they're compatible, right? Okay, all right, well that's not that impressive, okay, but then there's more to be said, which is when philosophers try to analyze free will, right? So I said this thing about alternate possibilities, but philosophers try to analyze what it means to have alternate possibilities. Like, what exactly does it mean that something that didn't happen was possible or could have been done? Okay, and when you try to analyze it, sort of, if you analyze it enough that philosophers feel satisfied that it's perfectly clear, it always or virtually always winds up that you have a compatibilist account. Okay, so here's an account. What does it mean that you could have done A? Maybe it means that if you had tried to do A, then you would have succeeded. Okay, all right, so now that isn't actually a good analysis. There are counterexamples of that, but it's enough to just make the point. Like if you thought that that's what it means, that you could have done something, then it's compatible with determinism that you could have done something that you didn't do, right? So, okay, so I raised my hand there and I could have not done that. That means that if I tried to keep my hand down, it would have stayed down. Oh, that's compatible with determinism, right? It's just that I was determined to try to raise the hand, and so it went up. But if I had not tried to raise it, which of course would have meant that the entire history of the universe had been different all the way back to the Big Bang, but whatever. Okay, it would have required that. But nevertheless, if the entire history of the universe back to the Big Bang had been different in such a way that I didn't try to raise my hand at that time, then I would have succeeded in not raising the hand. Okay, so determinism is compatible with my being such that I could have done otherwise, right? Okay, but so that's just an example, and just other things that compatibilists say are, to be free just means that you're able to do what you want, right? It means that you're not interfered with by external forces. There's nobody stopping you from pursuing your goals or something like that. And then this could be illustrated by, there's this dialogue that the philosopher W.T. Stace, the compatibilist, wrote, where this little bits of dialogue where he imagines you interview somebody and the person's like, "Hey, I once went without food for a week," and you say, "Oh, why did you do that? Did you do that of your own free will?" And he goes, "No, I was stuck in the desert and I couldn't find any food." Okay, and then you imagine talking to Mahatma Gandhi, and Gandhi says, "I once went without food for a week," and you go, "Oh, why did you do that? Did you do that of your own free will?" And he goes, "Yes, I was on a hunger strike. I was trying to get Britain to withdraw from India." Okay, and what that's supposed to illustrate is, you notice that in both cases, the person gives an explanation, which I guess is a causal explanation. They cite the cause for their going without food. But in one case, they say it was of their own free will. In the other case, it wasn't. And what's the difference? So that's supposed to illustrate the difference is not that there was a cause in one case and no cause in the other. The difference is that in one case, the cause was external. They were in the desert and there was no food. And in the other case, the cause was internal, which was Gandhi wanted to get India to withdraw, to get the British to withdraw from India, right? So it was his own values and beliefs and goals, right? Okay, so if that's the case, then that means that doing things of your own free will is compatible with determinism, right? i.e., free actions are not actions with no cause. They're actions where the causes are your own beliefs and values, as opposed to external forces that constrain them.
Yes, there's so much more to be said in this. So interesting. Okay, let's push on. We will leave free will behind and we'll move on to ethical theory now. So I want to talk about utilitarianism. So how do philosophers define utilitarian principles, particularly in terms of evaluating actions based on their consequences and their impact on overall well-being?
Yeah. So the utilitarian view, utilitarianism is the most popular ethical theory. But it's rejected by most people, but it's still the most popular theory because there is no theory that most philosophers agree on, right? There's a lot of disagreement. Okay. But so but if somebody has a systematic ethical theory, it's more likely to be utilitarianism than anything else. And it's the view that, roughly speaking, you should maximize well-being. Okay. So traditionally, John Stuart Mill's view was you should do whatever produces the most pleasure or happiness for the most people. Okay, you can distinguish three elements of this, right? One element is hedonism, which is that the only thing that's intrinsically good is pleasure. Okay, and then subsequently, some other utilitarians, other people who are still called utilitarians have said, it's not really exactly pleasure, it's desire satisfaction. Because people could desire things other than pleasure, so it's not quite the same. But anyway, okay, so the second element was altruism, which is you should count other people's interests as being at least as important as your own, and other beings, as a matter of fact, right? So most utilitarians are like animal welfare advocates, right? Because, animals have pleasure and pain too. They could have desires satisfied and frustrated too. And that's the only thing that matters. Only thing that matters in the universe is either desire satisfaction or pleasure and pain. They have it, so, they matter just like we do. Okay, and then the third element of the theory is consequentialism, which is the right thing to do is always the thing that maximizes the good. Okay, so the good is well-being, like beings having benefits. Other beings count just as much as you, and you should produce as much of what's good as you can, right? And maximize the sum of good minus bad. Okay, and then so what else do we want to say about this?
I kind of wanted to just explore, I guess. So I'll just riff a little bit here as well, because I think we can kind of use the example of effective altruism and individuals like Peter Singer, etc., as kind of prime examples of. I mean, this is kind of the bit where your book made me squirm the most, and it has done both all three times I've gone through it, around the sort of kind of giving to charity element, and also the sort of giving up animal products, veganism sort of arguments that you lay out, and the responses that you have. That sort of somebody responds to that, and then you kind of give your counter or your rebuttal to their response. So I guess using sort of that as an example, or either the veganism or even effective altruism, it might just be helpful to kind of use that to flesh out why utilitarianism is so powerful. And also, I guess, we can kind of bring deontology into this, but kind of what's to stop somebody from giving everything, from, as you mentioned in the book, wading into the pool repeatedly to try and save every single child, because it's almost like you should do that even at detriment to yourself, as long as you can continue to do that. It's a really fascinating kind of argument.
Yeah. So, like, I'm not a utilitarian, but I like the utilitarians. They're nice. They're nice people. And anyway, some of the more, I guess, radical implications of utilitarianism are also kind of implications of any reasonable view, right? Okay, like Singer is famous for giving this argument that you're morally obligated to donate to charity. Now, so virtually everyone agrees that it's good to give to charity. But most people think that it's just a sort of extra super erogatory thing that you could do that's nice, but you don't have to do, right? So Singer's argument is, no, if you don't give to charity, then you're a horrible person. Okay. And so this is obvious on the utilitarian view, because like you've got a bunch of money, and obviously spending it on yourself would create a lot less good than donating at least a large portion of it to charities, right, which are saving people's lives around the world. And if you're going to donate to charity, obviously, as the effective altruists say, you should try to pick like the best charity, right, or at least close to the best charity that you can find, like not just a random charity, right? It doesn't just matter that you give away money, right? What matters is how much good you're doing. So like try to give it to the people who are going to do the most good. So anyway, so it's obvious on the utilitarian view, but actually there's like you don't even have to be a utilitarian, right? So you could just be a normal person, right? If you're walking past this shallow pond and you see a child drowning in the pond, should you pull the child out? Okay, and the reason it's a shallow pond is that there's no danger of an adult drowning. And I assume you're an adult. So, okay. So you could just pull the child out and then you save his life. But here's the thing. Then you get your clothes muddy and then, you would miss your class because you're going to class. Okay. Well, obviously you have to pull the child out anyway, even though you're going to get your clothes wet. So, okay. And then, that's supposed to be analogous to there are these people suffering in the developing world and you could help them by donating money to charity. And you don't want to do it just because there's it's a minor inconvenience to you, right? Because you don't want to give up the money because you want to spend it on yourself, but you could just give up some luxuries that you totally don't need, right? And then you could save other people's lives. So, not donating to charity is kind of like being the asshole who just walks past the child drowning in the pond, right? Okay. So, and you don't have to be a utilitarian to appreciate that. Like any normal person, if they see the child in the pond, would think that they have to pull the child out, right? Okay. And then the other controversy, the even more controversial, but also even more hard to avoid conclusion is, well, you got to treat animals a lot better, right? So most people are buying various animal products, especially meat, but also like eggs and dairy and whatever, and leather and stuff. And the way that they're produced involves inflicting a very large amount of suffering, which is many, many times larger than the amount of pleasure that you get. Right. And one way that I know this is that, it's estimated that we kill around 74 billion animals per year. That's almost 10 times the entire human population of the earth. The total number of humans who ever existed is something like 110 billion estimated. Okay. So in 2 years, humans kill more non-human animals than the total number of humans who have ever existed on the earth. Right. And most of them are in just lives of horrible suffering before they're killed. Right. So, if you care about pleasure and pain and, desire frustration, it's like, the amount of suffering on the factory farms where the animals are being raised is, it's like, if it happened to you, call it torture, right? So it's plausible that the total amount of suffering that we inflict every couple of years is comparable to the total amount of suffering of all humans ever, just because of the numbers, right? So, it's pretty clear that it's not worth it, right? Okay. And I just think, well, if you're utilitarian, you have to be against that. But I think if you're even just a normal person, if you have any sense of ethics, what ethical view can there be where it's fine to cause suffering that's 1,000 times greater than the amount of pleasure that you're getting just so that you can get a little bit of pleasure? Anyway. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it did. I kind of want to rewind just briefly to go back to Peter Singer and to go back to the fact that we're obviously that he argues that we're obligated almost to give to charity, like we should do this. It's a thing we should be doing. What I'm going to say, I don't think it's going to make complete sense, and that's kind of why I wanted to raise this with you. Obviously, Peter Singer is known as a utilitarian, I believe. At least most of his work is within that space, but he almost works himself into a deontological position where he's giving you almost like not rules, but kind of like decrees or narratives or arguments and reasons for why somebody should do this thing. Like if they aren't doing it, there is something fundamentally wrong. And I don't know whether you can kind of speak into that. Kind of, it feels like he switches into sort of rights and obligations where he started from a different position. And I'm aware that something's gone wrong in my thinking in this space. I think that might be quite a nice one to flesh out, to talk about the two different perspectives.
Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah. Well, so, traditionally the contrast for the utilitarian view is the deontological view. And the word deontological, the root of it is duty, study of duty. Right. Okay. So, deontologists are people who believe in duties, but that's something of a misnomer, it's not exactly a misnomer, but it's not that informative, right? Because every ethical theory in some sense maybe not every ethical thing. Anyway, a lot of people believe in duties. They just don't necessarily believe in the same duties as the deontologists, right? And so consequentialists could believe in duties. They just think that your duty is to maximize the good, right? Produce the best consequences that you can. And so the deontologists are people who think that sometimes your duty is not to produce the most good that you can. This might seem paradoxical. I don't know. But just, on your point about, well, does this fit with the utilitarian view? So classically, the utilitarian view was, what you're obligated to do is produce as much good as possible. That's a super demanding theory. Some utilitarians now are saying, no, that's not the best view. So my colleague Alistair Norcross says, actually, there's no such thing as obligation. It's just that there are better and worse things to do. Okay, and so the best thing to do is to produce as much good as possible. But then, there's a series of other things. And so there's not going to be any fact about whether you did your duty. There's just like, you did this and it was this good. So here's some better things you could have done and some worse things you could have done. Those are all the moral facts. So anyway, So, why would somebody not be a consequentialist? Okay, so like here's a famous hypothetical. So there's a doctor in a hospital. Let's say you're the doctor in the hospital. And you have 5 patients who need organ transplants, otherwise they will die. You also have this one patient who is healthy, but he just happens that, and the organ transplant patients, they all need 5 different organs. And you have this one healthy patient who's got good organs of all those kinds. And suppose that somehow he's compatible with the other 5. Like how the blood type O people are universal donors. Okay. So you could kill this one healthy patient, then you could take his organs and give them to the other 5. Right. And, just to be clear so that, nobody tries to avoid the point of the example. No, he will not voluntarily give away his organs. Right? He's not going to agree to this. So, but you could kill him anyway. Okay. And then one person would die and then 5 people would live. 5 is greater than 1. So you should do it, right? So it looks like an implication of utilitarianism that you do that. All right. Then you might think, well, but if somebody finds out about it, then I'll lose my medical license. I'll go to prison. And then I won't be able to save other people's lives. Okay. But, I'm just going to stipulate that nobody's going to find out about it. Okay. Right. But by the way, even if you go to prison for the rest of your life, it's still worth it. Because you saved 5 lives, right? You took 1, so it was a net 4 lives. So even if you suffer for the rest of your life, the suffering is still outweighed. Okay. And, if you lose your medical license, well, like that only matters if you were actually going to save a bunch of other lives. So I assume that you weren't actually, right? The only way you were going to save other lives was by doing similar things like that. So anyway, okay. And, you can have situations in which it's highly unlikely that you'd be caught. So. Okay, and so, the consequentialists will sort of they'll try to come up with reasons why it might be bad, negative consequences, and then you have to modify the scenario and add in stipulations. If you add in enough stipulations that they admit that it wouldn't have some big negative consequence, then they would say, I guess you got to harvest the organs, right? So kill the healthy patient. Anyway, so most people think that that's horribly wrong. Almost everyone, right? If you do a survey of classes, almost everyone, and I think every once in a while there's some utilitarian student in the class. But anyway, so there's examples like that. There's another example where there's there's been a crime that has caused a lot of public outrage in your town. You're the sheriff of the town. You can't find the person who actually did it. And you think that there are going to be riots during which more people are going to be harmed if you don't punish somebody. So you could frame an innocent person, which will cause them to be punished for this crime, but that will stop the riots, okay? And the punishment that the innocent person suffers will be less bad than all of the harm that the riots are going to do. So do you frame the innocent person, right? And almost everyone says, no, we can't do that, right? And so, so this is illustrating why it doesn't appear actually that you're always obligated to do the thing with the best consequences. Don't always do the best thing, right? Or don't always bring about the best overall state of affairs.
So interesting, isn't it? The way that ethics it's a complete I want to say minefield, but not in a bad way. Like there's so many areas to explore, and then you can go and look at counterexamples, and you can begin to kind of really dive into this. I mean, this is why I loved your book, right? It was a fantastic overview or an introductory course, as you mentioned at the end. I'm going to leave ethics there. I'm aware we could carry on for quite a while. I kind of wanted to land the show talking about common sense. You know, your book says a mostly common sense guide to philosophy is the sort of subline or subtitle. Yeah. So could you just speak to this idea about common sense and how important it is when we're trying to engage with philosophy?
Yeah. I mean, so, common sense is a bit of a technical term in epistemology. It's, right. So, because when I say that, I think a lot of people think I just mean any belief that's widely shared, like any belief that a majority of people hold or something like that. That's not what I mean. Like in epistemology, when people talk about common sense beliefs, they mean roughly the very most obvious things that you can think of. Okay, like, I have a hand said when you're holding it right in front of your face, right? Well, there's this thing right in front of my face that I can see. That's my hand, right? Or, D. Moore gives examples like, the world has existed for many years. Like it did not just pop into existence, right? I've spent my life at or near the surface of the earth. And, like I've never been to Mars. Okay. This is interesting because philosophers frequently have arguments that are incompatible with common sense beliefs. So like the arguments for external world skepticism, which claim that you don't know anything about the world around you. So it's kind of an element of common sense that some people know some things. Like a lot of people know how many hands they have. I think that's kind of a common sense belief. Or there will be philosophical arguments against free will. Okay, so like I think common sense belief is, I should not stick this pencil in my eye. I shouldn't do that. Okay, and then I think the rejection of free will implies that that's false, because there's no such thing as what somebody should do, because nobody has any choice about what they do. All right. Also, there are people who argue against people who argue that, apart from the anti-free will people, there are people who argue that there's no such thing as should. Like there are no reasons for anybody to do anything or not to do anything. There's no good or bad. Nothing is better or worse than anything else, right? All values are illusory. Okay. So I think that implies that there's nothing wrong with sticking the pencil through my eye. There's no reason not to do that. And also, implies that Hitler didn't do anything wrong. Okay. So, all right. and apparently there are a bunch of people who believe things like this, or they sort of believe them. They quasi believe them, right? Like when you're in a philosophical discussion, they believe them, but then when they go out into normal life, they don't act like they believe them anymore. Right. And then, so what should your reaction be? You hear an argument for some like seemingly crazy view. Well, I guess, not everyone has a reaction that they're crazy, but let's just say you hear an argument against something that would seem extremely obvious. Like the thing they're arguing against would seem extremely obvious to almost everyone from any culture throughout human history, right? Because I think that's true of all the examples. Like every society throughout human history, virtually everyone periodically makes judgments about what somebody should or shouldn't do. And also makes judgments about like the physical objects around them and that they know things. Okay. So anyway, you hear such an argument, what should your reaction be? And then you try to think of flaws in the argument. And what if you can't see any flaws in the argument, or you can't think of any good objections to any of the premises or any of the inferences? Then what should you think? Okay. And the answer is you should still think that there's something wrong with it, right? And why is that? Well, because it's more plausible that there's something wrong with the argument that you haven't identified than it is that this totally crazy thing is true, right? Okay, so here's an illustration, right? Let's say that you're in a physics class and then you get this hard problem on your homework, and it involves, let's say it involves calculating the circumference of the Earth from some other data, right? Like Eratosthenes calculated roughly the circumference of the Earth by, looking at shadows of sticks at different latitudes or something. Okay, anyway, so you do the calculation. That's actually not a hard problem. But anyway, you do the calculation, and let's say you get the result that the circumference of the Earth is about 50 miles. what should you think? I think that's right. You should think you made a mistake. What if you go over the calculation again, you can't find a mistake? Then should you believe it? No. You should still think that you made a mistake that you can't find. Okay. Like, okay, what if everyone in your class, you go talk to the other students in class and you have them look at your calculation. They can't find anything wrong with it. Then what should you think? You should still think that you made a mistake, right? And by the way, this is not shocking. It's not shocking if somebody makes a mistake that they can't identify. And it's not even shocking if your friends can't identify it either. And it's not shocking if you show 100 people and they can't identify the mistake, because that happens to human beings all the fucking time. Like, we constantly make errors and don't notice them, and then have trouble seeing them and have trouble seeing other people's errors and so on. And then if you look at the history of philosophy, actually, you can know that philosophers are constantly being wrong because they're constantly disagreeing with each other, including when philosophers give arguments that they themselves claim are totally conclusive arguments. Like, philosophers are constantly claiming to prove things that are incompatible with the things that other philosophers, quote, proved. Okay, so it is not shocking if a philosophical argument is wrong. As a matter of fact, when you hear philosophical arguments for anything interesting, like, you should be skeptical, just from what the subject matter is. You're talking about a philosophical issue. You should already know that there's a good chance that you're going to go wrong. Okay. So anyway, the reason for believing that a philosophical argument is correct is way, way lower than the justification for the common sense beliefs, right? So the common sense beliefs are the things that are most obvious. So just prima facie, on the face of it, they're the most justified things. And like, the conclusions of philosophical arguments are among the least justified beliefs that we have, right? Because philosophical arguments are among the least reliable belief forming methods that human beings have ever devised, right? Okay, so anyway, yeah, so, even if I didn't have counters to these crazy arguments, like, you should not believe the determinists, you should not believe the nihilists or the skeptics.
What a fantastic way to end the conversation, I think. Before I let you disappear, you obviously mentioned the blog already, but please plug that one more time. And where else would you want people to go to find your work and follow you?
Oh, yeah. So the blog is Fake News, FAKENOUS.substack.com. And, that's nous is the Greek word for mind. And it's an allusion to the fact that there's a philosophy journal called Nous. And there's also another blog called Daily News. It's a philosophy blog. And so mine is the Fake News, because you don't want to confuse it with either of those other things. Anyway, I have a website, which is owl232.net, OWL232.net. By the way, there's no www in it. So make sure that you, because if you put the www, it will not find it. And everybody should buy my books on Amazon.
Oh, yeah. I'll make sure there are links to all of that in the description. So listener, viewer, check those out now. Professor Huemer, thank you so much for your time today, for answering these questions and for delving into this with me. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Yep. Thanks for having me. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And make sure you check us out over on Locals. Cheers.